What happens when one of television's most beloved comedic minds walks into what should be a routine late-night interview, only to find himself face-to-face with a host who seems determined to turn every question into an attack? Tonight, we're diving into one of the most uncomfortable moments in late-night television history. When Larry David, the genius behind Seinfeld and Curb Your Enthusiasm, found himself in an increasingly hostile situation that would ultimately lead to him being escorted off the set. This isn't just another celebrity interview gone wrong. This is a masterclass in how not to treat your guests, and it reveals a side of late-night television that most viewers never get to see. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure to hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments what you think about how hosts should treat their guests, because trust me, you're going to have some strong opinions after hearing what went down that night. The evening started like any other taping of Jimmy Kimmel Live. Larry David had agreed to appear on the show to promote his latest project, something he rarely did given his well-known disdain for the traditional promotional circuit. Those familiar with Larry's work know that he's never been one to play the Hollywood game, preferring to let his creative work speak for itself rather than engaging in the typical celebrity song and dance that most talk shows demand. He arrived at the studio in his characteristic understated fashion, wearing a simple button-down shirt and slacks, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else but sitting in a green room waiting to be called onto a soundstage. The production team briefed him on the usual talking points, the kinds of softball questions that most guests expect during these appearances. They discussed his current projects, some light-hearted anecdotes from his career, maybe a funny story about working with Julia Louis-Dreyfus, or his experiences creating some of the most quotable television moments in history. Larry nodded along, though anyone who knew him could see he was already mentally preparing himself for what he considered to be a necessary evil in the entertainment business. What Larry didn't know was that Jimmy Kimmel had apparently decided this interview was going to be different. Whether it was a bad day, pressure from network executives, or simply a misguided attempt to create viral content, something had shifted in Kimmel's approach. Instead of the typical friendly banter that most guests could expect, there was an edge to his preparation that suggested this wasn't going to be the comfortable conversation that had been promised to Larry's representatives. As Larry was led from the green room to the stage, he maintained his usual demeanor, that slightly annoyed but resigned expression that had become his trademark both on screen and off. He settled into the guest chair next to Kimmel's desk, adjusting his posture in that familiar way that suggested he was already calculating how quickly he could get through this obligation and return to his relatively private life. The studio audience applauded as they always did, completely unaware that they were about to witness something that would become one of the most talked-about moments in late-night television. Kimmel opened with what seemed like standard pleasantries, thanking Larry for being on the show and making some comment about how long it had been since his last appearance. But even in those opening moments, there was something in his tone that suggested this wasn't going to be the typical softball interview. Larry responded with his characteristic dry humor, making a self-deprecating comment about how he generally tried to avoid these kinds of appearances, which got a laugh from the audience, but seemed to irritate Kimmel in a way that was subtle, but noticeable to anyone paying close attention. The first real sign that something was off came when Kimmel began asking about Larry's creative process, but in a way that felt more like an interrogation than a conversation. Instead of the usual questions about inspiration and collaboration, Kimmel seemed intent on challenging every aspect of how Larry approached his work. He questioned whether Larry's success was more about luck than talent, whether his neurotic persona was genuine or just a calculated character designed to appeal to a specific demographic. Larry, who had been expecting to discuss his latest project in a straightforward manner, found himself having to defend not just his current work, but his entire career. His responses became more clipped, more defensive, as he tried to navigate what was clearly becoming a hostile interview environment. The audience, sensing the tension, grew quieter, their laughter becoming more forced and uncomfortable, as they realized they weren't watching the usual friendly chat between a host and his guest. The atmosphere in the studio grew increasingly tense as Kimmel continued his line of questioning, seemingly oblivious to or perhaps deliberately ignoring the discomfort he was creating. Larry, who had initially tried to deflect the hostile questions, with his trademark humor, began to show visible signs of frustration. His responses became shorter, more pointed, and anyone familiar with his work could recognize the warning signs that he was reaching his limit with what he clearly viewed as an unprofessional approach to what should have been a routine interview. Kimmel then made the decision that would ultimately define the entire encounter. Instead of recognizing that his guest was uncomfortable and perhaps steering the conversation in a more positive direction, he doubled down on his aggressive approach. He began questioning Larry's relevance in modern comedy, suggesting that his style of humor was outdated and that perhaps his best days were behind him. This wasn't the playful ribbing that sometimes characterizes late-night interviews. This was a direct attack on Larry's professional legacy and artistic integrity. Larry's face changed visibly at this point. The resigned tolerance that had characterized his demeanor throughout the early part of the interview was replaced by something much more serious. He leaned forward slightly, his voice taking on a tone that anyone who had watched Curb Your Enthusiasm would recognize as the precursor to one of his character's legendary confrontations. He asked Kimmel directly what he was trying to accomplish with this line of questioning, whether this was supposed to be an interview or some kind of public humiliation. Rather than backing down or attempting to defuse the situation, Kimmel seemed to interpret Larry's pushback as an invitation to escalate further. He made a comment about how Larry's reputation for being difficult was apparently well-deserved, suggesting that his inability to handle a few challenging questions proved that he was exactly the kind of person that people in the industry had warned him about. The audience, who had been growing increasingly uncomfortable throughout the exchange, now sat in almost complete silence, unsure of how to react to what was unfolding before them. Larry's response was swift and direct. He pointed out that he had come on the show as a favor, that he didn't need the exposure or the platform, and that he certainly didn't need to sit there and be insulted by someone who wouldn't have a career without the groundwork laid by comedians like himself. This wasn't the scripted banter that audiences expected from late-night television. This was a real confrontation between two people who had clearly reached an impasse. Kimmel, perhaps realizing that he had pushed too far, but unable or unwilling to back down, made what would prove to be the final mistake of the evening. He suggested that Larry's reaction was proving his point about him being difficult to work with, and that maybe this was why he preferred to work alone rather than collaborating with other people. He then made a comment about how Larry's success might have been more about being in the right place at the right time, rather than any particular talent or insight. The moment those words left Kimmel's mouth, something shifted in Larry's entire demeanor. This wasn't just about a bad interview anymore. This was about professional respect and basic human decency. Larry stood up from his chair, something that immediately caught the attention of everyone in the studio, from the cameramen to the production assistants who had been watching the interview with growing concern. Larry looked directly at Kimmel and delivered what would become one of the most quoted responses in late-night television history. He said that he had spent decades building a career based on honesty and integrity, that he had never needed to tear down other people to make himself look good, and that he wasn't about to start tolerating that kind of behavior now, especially not from someone who had built his own career on the foundation that Larry and others like him had established. The studio fell completely silent. Even the production crew, who had seen their share of uncomfortable moments during live tapings, recognized that this was something entirely different. This wasn't a planned bit or a publicity stunt. This was a genuine confrontation between two people who had fundamentally different ideas about professionalism and respect. Kimmel, perhaps finally recognizing the gravity of what he had created, attempted to laugh off the situation, suggesting that Larry was overreacting and that this was all just part of the fun of late-night television. But Larry wasn't having any of it. He made it clear that there was nothing fun about being disrespected on national television, and that if this was Kimmel's idea of entertainment, then he wanted no part of it. What happened next would be talked about in entertainment circles for years to come. Larry, still standing beside his chair, looked out at the audience and then back at Kimmel, with an expression that conveyed both disappointment and resolve. He announced that he was done with the interview, that he refused to participate in what he called a deliberate attempt to humiliate him for the sake of ratings, and that he had better things to do with his time than sit there and be insulted by someone who clearly didn't understand the first thing about conducting a professional interview. Kimmel, now clearly panicking as he realized that his guest was serious about leaving, tried to convince Larry to sit back down. He suggested that they could start over, maybe talk about something else, anything to salvage what was rapidly becoming a public relations nightmare. But Larry had made his decision. He told Kimmel that the damage was already done, that you couldn't unsay the things that had been said, and that the only appropriate response was for him to remove himself from a situation that had become untenable. The production team, who had been monitoring the situation from the control room, were now faced with an unprecedented situation. They had a guest who was walking off the set during a live taping, and a host who seemed to have no idea how to handle the crisis he had created. The director could be heard through the studio speakers trying to figure out whether to cut to commercial or continue filming what was clearly going to be television history. Larry began walking toward the exit, his movements deliberate and dignified despite the chaos that was erupting around him. Kimmel, now standing behind his desk, called out to him, asking him to please come back, that they could work this out, that there was no need for such a dramatic response to what he still insisted was just a misunderstanding. But Larry didn't even turn around. He continued walking, his posture straight and his pace steady, making it clear that his decision was final. As Larry reached the edge of the stage area, several production assistants approached him, clearly having been instructed, to try to convince him to return to his seat. But Larry's response was firm and polite. He thanked them for their professionalism, made it clear that his issue was not with them or with the show's staff, but that he simply could not and would not continue to participate in what he viewed as an ambush designed to embarrass him for entertainment value. Kimmel, now visibly flustered and clearly recognizing that this was not going to end well for him, made one final attempt to control the narrative. He addressed the audience directly, suggesting that Larry was being oversensitive, and that this kind of reaction was exactly what he had been talking about when he questioned Larry's ability to handle criticism. But this only served to reinforce Larry's point about the host's unprofessional behavior and complete lack of understanding about how to treat a guest with basic respect. The security personnel, who had been watching the situation unfold, now found themselves in the position of having to escort Larry from the building, not because he was causing any kind of disturbance, but because the situation had deteriorated to the point where his continued presence was clearly not welcome by the host. Larry cooperated fully with security, maintaining his dignity throughout the entire process, while making it clear that he was leaving by choice, not because he was being forced to do so. As Larry disappeared behind the stage curtains, the studio audience sat in stunned silence, unsure of how to process what they had just witnessed. This wasn't the kind of entertainment they had expected when they came to see a taping of a late-night talk show. They had just witnessed a masterclass in how quickly a professional situation can deteriorate when basic respect and courtesy are abandoned in favor of cheap shots and manufactured controversy. The aftermath of this confrontation would be felt throughout the entertainment industry, raising important questions about the responsibilities of talk show hosts and the treatment of guests who agree to appear on their programs. It served as a reminder that behind the polished veneer of late-night television are real people with real feelings, and that the pursuit of viral moments and ratings should never come at the expense of basic human decency and professional respect. So, what do you think about this incredible confrontation? Should hosts be able to challenge their guests, Or did Jimmy Kimmel cross a line that should never be crossed? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and make sure to subscribe for more incredible stories from the world of entertainment that you won't hear anywhere else.